I'm Rob, I'm white, and I'm interested in what that whiteness means. I'm interested in this both from an intellectual perspective and a desire to grow as a person and regain the bits of humanity that whiteness robs from me and from all of us. And I want to share one bit of history in particular. 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, another smaller rebellion took place in Jamestown. The rebellion was short, featured a less than sympathetic leader, and it ended in failure. Rarely comes up in high school history classes, and yet I promise it is very important. Bacon's rebellion led to a relatively new concept, the idea of race, being codified into law. It led to the creation of systems of racial hierarchy, privileging a new category of whites at the very top. This occurred not because of individuals' racist convictions, but because that power holders wanted to maintain their power. It's what Ta-Nehisi Coates means when he writes that race is the child of racism, not the father. And in this moment of history, we see how and why race is born. And we'll start with a couple of festering resentments. Poor lower class frontiers people and indentured servants harbored resentment against the upper class power holders and resentment against the Native American populations. They saw the power holders in Jamestown as having pushed them west to serve as a buffer. Nathaniel Bacon, this man here, he was not one of those poor frontiers people. He's the exiled son of a powerful English family. He owns 2 plots of land. He breaks with his class, though, in labeling the governor a deeply corrupt person and unwilling to fight the Native Americans. That summer, 1676, he rides that wave of resentment to a new seat in the House of Burgesses. He was elected. He's kind of seen as the voice of the people. He would soon begin raiding and killing Native Americans. He was labeled a rebel by the governor and imprisoned. He was released upon his supporters marching on Jamestown. He would continue to fight the natives and declare all-out war on the governor and the government. Meanwhile, it's important to understand the composition of Jamestown's population at the time. Power holders in Jamestown relied more heavily on indentured servants than enslaved people. Neither servants nor the enslaved held power in society, but together they had numbers. And Bacon, he actually understood this. And so in return for support, he promised pardons and freedom to both enslaved people and servants. In addition to those poor frontiers people, Bacon had overwhelming support. So the question becomes, did it work? Yes, and ultimately no. In September, his forces drove out the governor, who made desperate pleas to England to send in naval reinforcements. They captured Jamestown, they burned it to the ground. In October, though, our main character, Nathaniel Bacon, dies of dysentery. And these little Bacon X's that are coming onto his eyes right now were an absolute hit with my students, except for one who was like, Rob, geez, how long did you spend on this? And that is a very fair question. Ultimately, though, upon his death, the rebellion falls apart. The governor, Berkeley, regains power. It was a tumultuous summer, but in the end, the status quo remains unchanged. What did change, though, was how the wealthy viewed their power, which is to say that they were extremely scared. And as word of the rebellion, and most importantly, the composition of its rebels spread across the colonies, so did that fear among the power holders. They did not decide to share their wealth. They did not decide to make a more equal society. They decided to shift tactics. They start to lay the groundworks with laws that begin to reference categories based on the newly formed concept of race. White began to replace Christian, or white began to replace Christian, and Black was used to describe enslaved Africans. They define new privileges. These are white privileges, including full pardons for all white rebels. While Black rebels faced harsh punishment, new law mandated that indentured servants be provided with at least 50 acres of land, guns, food upon completion of their indenture. They manufacture resentment among whites toward Blacks. Poor whites become the armed defenders of the planter class. Anti-miscegenation laws begin to appear, banning marriage and any relations between Blacks and whites. Planters cut back on indentured servants and rapidly increase reliance on enslaved Africans. And each step they take helps to further separate those not in power, lowering the risk of any future rebellions. And in order to justify these actions, they use the idea of race, which becomes codified into law and implies a natural biological human hierarchy. The belief in natural racial categories is obviously still with us, and it's why it's important to see whiteness for what it is and to understand its origins as a politically constructed, highly malleable, as we can see from those census, the way that race has changed across the census over the years, as a system for maintaining dominance. Who is characterized as white has and will continue to change. The privileges afforded by whiteness change, but the essential structure and organizational practices of our society have remained constant. So understanding Bacon helps us to understand this much, at least. As made up and false as the idea of race is, it still holds very real social significance in the way that we go about our lives. And that's it. I can stop sharing, and if there are questions.
Yeah, Sarah?
So when and how did this go to Europe?
When did what go to Europe?
This idea of whiteness and race and stuff, because it's in Europe too. But if it started here, how did it get there? Or was it both at the same time?
It's kind of both at the same time. It begins. Societies have long had different forms of slavery. What was unique about the form of slavery taking hold in the Americas around this time is that it was enslaving this entirely different group of people. The West African kingdoms used to enslave people from other West African kingdoms that they had captured during wars. The Europeans used to enslave other Europeans. And so this is the first time that this form of slavery begins to take root, and they're looking almost immediately for ways to justify what they're doing because they do recognize that it's wrong. They do want to convert these enslaved people to Christianity, but then they're also having to reconcile that with, if we convert them to Christianity, then do we have to afford them the same rights and privileges and statuses as us fellow Christians? And so race just really naturally fills that void. Like the pseudoscience of race immediately begins to emerge, and it spreads pretty quickly, especially because Britain had such a, and a lot of those European powers had such a heavy influence in the Americas at this time as well.
Yeah, Oshan.
Hey, so I've always been curious about this, and I should have probably looked into it by now, but what do you think that there was an understanding of how powerful and insidious this idea was at the time? Was there a mastermind who was like Machiavellian, or even looking back to previous Machiavelli as an example, like, oh, this person's theory can be implemented in this situation to give us power? Because the way it's constructed, as you described, is it's incredibly self-reinforcing and perpetuating. And I'm just curious if that was intentional or just kind of like, well, we grabbed this power and in a way that happened to kind of work out or whatever.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like one person that we can point to. Like, in Stamped from the Beginning, the Ibram Kendi book, like he points to this fellow who is a writer for a Portuguese prince, and he labels him like the world's first racist because he's the first person that that begins to spread these racist ideas that there's a separate group of humans that are inferior and therefore suitable to enslavement. But then it kind of just spreads as slavery spreads across the Americas. And so it's hard to pinpoint a few people. It just becomes the easy rationalization for something that was largely seen as wrong, and just having people needed to reconcile that in their minds.
Yeah, I think I'm also referring to, though, to the way that whites, lower class whites, were essentially, they became the defenders of the upper class whites, and their reward was in that class, like they were rewarded in whiteness, but not in white privilege, right? that
Yeah.
that idea to me is not separate from, but it is a big part of the power in that concept. So anyway.
Yeah. There's so many of these colonial race laws that begin to pop up. And these are like some of the first times that you actually see the word white or black written into law somewhere. And at the same time as they are defining what it means to be black in the society, they're also affording new privileges to those white people. And I just listed like a couple of examples there, but it's everywhere. Isabel Wilkerson wrote that book, Caste, and The Warmth of Other Suns. And in The Warmth of Other Suns, she talks a lot about those Jim Crow laws. So different, but also related. And there was a law in one southern state in the 50s that said that a white person and a black person cannot play checkers together. So like the extent to which these laws attempted to govern the everyday lives and keep these people apart is just kind of wild.
I saw two more questions. I saw James waiting and Irving, I saw your hand up a moment ago.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure. I've always assumed that one of the kind of rationales, consciously or unconsciously, behind this is using racism as a wedge to divide people whose natural economic or class interests might be aligned. And I wonder if you could speak to that in this context specifically.
Oh, absolutely, right? It's like seeing that those poor whites, the indentured servants, the enslaved Africans were able to be brought together by, like, Nathaniel Bacon isn't like he's like a pretty nefarious character, but he was able to bring these groups together, and that actually inspired different rebellions up and down the East Coast there, and so you start to see these laws not just pop up in Jamestown, but all across British America at that time. Just recognizing that this was a real threat to their power.
Last question. We have a minute and a half left. Yeah, you're muted right now. You need to unmute. Talking to Irving.
Barbara, sorry, I haven't been able to switch the name. My question was answered. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, we got a minute and 15 seconds if anybody else has one.
I'll add one more thing. I was reading about the governor of Berkeley in Jamestown at the time. He had written to someone back in England the year prior to this rebellion taking place, and he was basically predicting, or not predicting, but he was worried that the lower classes would rise up and rebel against him. And he said something like 7 and 8 are living in squalor and poverty and can barely eat. And so they lived in this really unequal society. And so the only way to maintain that was to turn those 7/8 against each other. Thank you, everybody.